virtual Humanities Forum. I'm glad to be hosting the final Humanities Forum of the semester and wish we were all just gathering in person. And I said already, thank you to our speaker Allison Lange, for also being willing to take part in this experiment in the virtual talk. I know it's not nearly as good to talk to a computer screen as it is to talk to a room of people, and we're just really grateful that you're willing to do it, and wish we could be hosting you as we always do on campus, and having dinner with you, introducing you to our fabulous students and faculty. I don't know if there are any students here today, but if there are, welcome to students. We often have our humanities scholars who get merit scholarships in the humanities. We often have them as take part in these forum events. Amy Freud in the history department will properly introduce Allison in a minute. But because it is, sadly, our last Humanities Forum of the season, I just want to say a word of thanks, deep and heartfelt thanks to Courtney Hobson, coordinator in the Drescher Center, for all the work she does in putting on the Humanities Forum all year long. As many of you know, she is the linchpin. She is working on the forum all year long, and she manages and masterminds the process, from soliciting proposals for speakers to helping select them to making sure they get paid. Very important. I couldn't do it without her. So please join me in thanking Courtney for all the work she does all year. And I want you to know that even in these really uncertain times, and we don't know where we'll be or if we'll be in the fall, we are working hard on bringing you a terrific fall season. Stay tuned. There will be news over the summer about how and when and who we're bringing for the forum. And then lastly, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We're a reasonably small group, so I don't know if we need to turn off our video, but please be sure you have your microphones on mute. And if we begin to have trouble with bandwidth, I'll also ask you to turn off your video. We will hope to get to a Q&A session where we'll be able to have a discussion with voice. Somehow that goes wrong, we'll use the chat function on WebEx. But so the plan is to make sure everyone's mute while Allison is speaking. And then when you'd like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and either raise your hand or begin to speak, and we'll do our best to recognize you. We should have plenty of time for good Q&A. So thanks, and Amy, take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Amy Freud. I'm chair of the history department at UMBC, and I'm really pleased to welcome Allison Lange virtually to UMBC this semester. Professor Allison Lange is an associate professor of history at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, and I believe that is a recent promotion, so congratulations on that. She received her PhD from Brandeis in 2014, and she has a new book also coming out just next month entitled Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. And that's coming out with University of Chicago Press. Very impressive. And I think we'll be getting a taste of that from her today. This year being the centennial of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment means that Dr. Lange's work has a lot of a special pertinence to us right now. And her research has led to her being appointed as historian to the U.S. Congress Women's Suffrage Commission. And she's also helped curate a number of exhibits on women's fight for the vote. One, I believe, is opened now at the Schlesinger Library, or maybe not open, virtually opened maybe, at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard Harvard University. Professor Lange has won a lot of accolades and awards for her work over the years, and I was pleased to find out that she and I have both held the same fellowship at the Huntington Library. So it's a small academic world, right? People from all over come together and benefit from the work of libraries and archives. We're particularly pleased that the Drescher Center is recognizing Allison Lange and her work because she's representing a number of innovative fields that the history department at our institution is particularly interested in. It's rare to find someone who is a public historian, material cultural historian, digital humanities specialist, and a publicly engaged historian, meaning that she speaks to non-academics too. So very excited that we have you here today to talk to us about images of the fight for women's right to vote. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you. And thank you, Jessica and Courtney. Thank you all for inviting me to be here today. I do wish that we could have this, entire experience together in person, but I'm also really, really valuing this opportunity to take a break from everything else and enjoy some women's history and kind of community around this topic together. So I am very excited, as always, to talk about suffrage, and I'm very eager to have your questions and comments at the end too. This is a moment where there's so much new, exciting suffrage scholarship happening that it's a really exciting moment to have this conversation because there's so many new scholarship coming out, new suffragists that we had never really focused on in the past, new angles. It's really an exciting centennial moment to be researching this topic. So I am going to, as you might guess, since I study images, I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint here, and you guys should let me know if anything is off, if anything doesn't seem to be working properly. Just let me know. So I am speaking today about images in the fight for women's voting rights in the United States. And when we're thinking about the women's suffrage movement, a lot of us don't tend to think about the ways that anti-suffragists were part of this movement, part of this conversation. And one of the things that this research tells us is that thinking about anti-suffragists and suffragists in conversation is really important for understanding this movement. And in particular, my research really focuses on thinking about the ways they're having this conversation through public images that are circulating in the press and throughout the United States. And originally, as you can guess, a lot of these anti-suffrage images dominated popular culture, but it's not until the 1860s when we have suffragists actually developing a new visual campaign, piecemeal at first, but then something that's very masterfully coordinated by the end. And one of the goals of telling this story is to make sure that we're thinking about the ways that images are communicating ideas about everything from gender and race and class, thinking about how these things are related to politics and power. Not only in the 19th century, of course, but also the ways that these historical images laid the foundations, created the visual conventions, the stereotypes and things that we're still engaging with today in a really meaningful way. So I'm going to start, you may be surprised, but I'm actually going to start in the 18th century for this project. And the reason I start here is because I found that in order to understand, what's happening by the 1910s in the suffrage movement, we need to start at the beginning and think about the ways that men and women, that gender, race, class, etc., were represented from the earliest days of the American colonies. So from the colonial era through the present, satirical images consistently represented political women as power-hungry and masculine-looking activists who deserted their families to pursue fame and end traditional family values. Pictures that circulated publicly often portrayed elite white men as powerful, revered leaders, but comparable imagery of women and people of color barely existed. And so I'm sure a lot of you have seen this image before. It's a mezzotint printed in London in 1775 by an artist named Philip Daw, who had certainly never been to the colonies before, read about an event happening in North Carolina, probably by newspaper, and decided to create this cartoon from that news article. It's of a gathering of women who are signing a boycott to a boycott of tea. They don't want to import and purchase British tea here. And as you can see, this is not the stereotypical ladylike gathering that women are supposed to be having in this era. They are they're ignoring this child under the table. A dog is licking the child while he urinates on a tea canister. Women in the back, one is drinking from a large punch bowl, of course that's alcohol. And we have another woman in the center being kind of convinced to sign this document by a man who seems romantically interested in her. One other thing to point out is that we see a Black woman behind the woman with the gavel, and she has an inkwell in her hand. And she looks like she's even thinking about perhaps signing the document too. As we know, in 18th century North Carolina, she's probably intended to be representing an enslaved woman. So one of the things that's happening here is, of course, this idea that if women are participating in politics, it will disrupt these traditional roles that they are supposed to have, right? They're supposed to be caring for their children. They are not, right? The other thing it's telling us is that if gender roles shift, it will affect other social hierarchies as well, right? So the racial hierarchies, the economic system that was in place in North Carolina at that time might also be threatened by a shift in women's political participation. And so these are themes that we're going to see throughout this era. This is an 1851 lithograph. So while this mezzotint was a very expensive type of print, really available to elites in London, but also in the colonies, you would have been fairly wealthy to purchase this. Probably very much supportive of Philip Daw's views here. This is a lithograph, though. By the 1850s, lithographs are pretty cheap, pretty widely available. And this is a very similar type of image. As you can see, this is from 1851. So just a few years after the Seneca Falls Convention, just 1 year after the very first national meeting in Worcester, women's rights meeting in Worcester. And this is part of a book called Bloomerism, a short illustrated book called Bloomerism in Practice. We see President Mrs. Turkey in the center, smoking, leaning back. And believe it or not, that is her husband beside her, hunched over, doing menial tasks like sewing. On the wall, there's a Women's Rights Convention framed sign. Of course, there's a child in the foreground crying because the parents are not paying attention to him. In the background, we have again this link of this fear between the end of slavery and the fact that women of color are also going to demand rights, as well as women's rights more broadly, right? So these two women in the back, no more basement and no more kitchen, so suggesting that that's probably a domestic worker. And then the other one is also calling for the end of slavery too. And these women are, of course, wearing bloomers, which we have probably seen before, something that in 1851 suffragists were still wearing, but very soon after abandoned because of the extreme popularity of cartoons like these. For better or for worse, right after they started meeting in the 1840s and 1850s, this is a moment of major technological change. making these kinds of cartoons very easy to print and very cheap to reproduce. Here's another example from Harper's New Monthly Magazine from 1851, another one featuring women wearing bloomers, smoking. This is another really popular sign of women not being ladylike, being feminine. Also, hands on their hips, even the way that they're standing, when you look at this, suggests a lack of this kind of feminine submissiveness that is expected. We also have, you can see a woman and another woman locking arms, suggesting a really subtle, implicit suggestion that these women are not, perhaps not even in need of men anymore. Right? They're wearing very masculine looking clothes, right? They've got riding props, top hats, and a bulldog, a very aggressive bulldog in the front. And the one man in this image is in the back, kind of fleeing the scene to another, to leave them alone. And this is from 1869, so this is about 100 years after that first Ladies of Edenton print. So 1869, just to kind of refresh our memories, is of course this moment after the Civil War. The 15th Amendment is being debated, which effectively grants Black men the right to vote. People are trying to figure out where women's rights fits into this. So this is a cartoon by Currier and Ives, which was a extremely popular printmaker in the 19th century, very accessible to many middle-class Americans to purchase a print like this. You could purchase a print like this in a print shop, kind of a news shop, kind of anywhere. They were around. You could purchase them by mail, and these show women voting, casting a ballot. They're talking about voting for the celebrated man tamer, Susan Sharptongue. And of course, they have these outlandish styles. We have one woman still wearing in the center bloomers, which suffragists had long ago abandoned because they were so ridiculed. And you also have these outlandish hairstyles and dresses. And so one thing that is worth pointing out is that whether women are wearing bloomers or whether they're wearing very traditional feminine clothing, either way, they're still being made fun of for wearing either overly frivolous, fashionable attire or overly practical, masculine garb. So that's something to consider as we move forward. So we can see in these pictures, this is a century of images, but anti-suffragists, their ideas are remaining shockingly similar over the years, and we can talk about whether they do so in some ways into the 21st century. So while opponents relied on these old tropes, suffragists coordinated the first visual campaign to transform notions of political womanhood. Visual politics, the strategic use of images to promote a cause or a candidate, proved central to their efforts to change the ways that Americans thought of political women. They needed to change the ways Americans kind of stereotyped them. So by the late 19th century, suffragists coordinated visual campaigns that painted white female citizens as virtuous mothers and wives. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, the dominant group, argued that women could balance domesticity with political participation and professional goals. Their votes would actually reinforce traditional gender norms and make society more moral. Men could remain political leaders and heads of households without becoming domestic. Voting women would not disrupt heteronormativity or white supremacy either. This campaign, with its method designed by publicity professionals and carried out by a generation of educated female journalists and artists, won widespread support. So this vision had appeal, but it did not reflect the realities of women's lives or the diversity of the movement. Competing suffrage groups promoted alternatives. I should have put this up earlier, but we'll come back to this one, I promise. So competing images were, of course, by the National Association of Colored Women, which presented an image of refined, elite Black women, while the National Women's Party distributed photographs of pretty young white women protesting in the streets. Although the latter's campaign differed from that of the National American Suffrage Association, Both groups' visual campaigns emphasize that suffragists were white. My forthcoming book analyzes over a century of gendered political imagery that Americans continue to respond to, negotiate with, and challenge. The manuscript brings together analysis of politics, culture, technology, and the women's rights movement. From 18th century woodblock engravings through 20th century photographic halftones, improvements in technology combined with popular recognition of imagery's power to revolutionize politics. This book examines popular pictures rather than personal ones intended for family and friends. These public images were at the heart of the development of a shared national visual language composed of symbols and gendered conventions. This language helped fuel the rise of mass society and the highly visual culture of 21st century life. Images are political. They're an often overlooked register of political argument in the past. The pictures that flooded into coffee houses and parlors also defined and reflected popular conceptions of political power. The historical images and objects that are part of daily lives and national discourses further develops our understanding of a period's politics. Pictures do not simply illustrate a person or an event. Instead, an image's content, medium, and relationship to contemporaneous imagery offer clues that point to a broader story. Historical books and documentaries often feature women's rights imagery simply as illustrations. But these pictures illuminate the public debates about conceptions of gender, race, and power over the course of a century. Picturing Political Power interprets political cartoons and photographic portraits as part of an evolving visual campaign. The images that suffragists and their opponents sold are just as important as the speeches they gave and the letters they wrote. Gendered imagery has shaped and continues to shape the relationship between women and the state. So as we move forward today to go through plenty more images to work with, I want to think about just like three main points that I'd like to kind of walk away with. One is this link between politics and technology. So we're really thinking about the ways that over this long 19th century period, technology is changing, and so is politics. And suffragists in particular are taking advantage of every kind of new technology, visual and otherwise, to innovate and create these exciting visual campaigns from first on a very small scale in the mid-19th century, but then with the creation of these national press committees, hiring professional publicity managers by the late 19th and early 20th century. The second thing is that gender has an overlooked visual component to it. So when we're thinking about gender, it's not just something that you can kind of think of particular images when you're thinking about gender, right? So we're thinking about the ways that femininity and masculinity were visually represented, reinforced, and defined in popular culture. And so the main kind of point, this third point that I want us to think about, is the ways that images were really central to this campaign for women's rights, and of course, central to the campaign against women's rights. So I'm going to go through a lot of wonderful images, and feel free to take a note of any questions or any slides we want to come back to in the Q&A, and I'm more than happy to do that. So I want to start with these portraits. Probably a lot of us have seen or know that Frederick Douglass is actually considered to be the most photographed American of the 19th century. He believed very strongly that images were a valuable tool. He gave lectures about the ways that images could kind of shape people's understanding of their world. And he really inspired Sojourner Truth, who he interacted with both as reformers, especially in the anti-slavery and civil rights, and of course the women's suffrage circuit. Sojourner Truth decided to start sitting for photographs, and I would like to think that she was inspired by Douglass, but I don't have that, I don't have her writing that down, unfortunately. In the 1860s, and about 1863 is when her earliest portrait that we can date is from. And this is a moment when photography the earliest photographs were called daguerreotypes, and they were not able to be reproduced. So you couldn't take a daguerreotype of anyone and sell it to the masses because you couldn't reproduce it that many times. But in the 1850s, you have this new process called the wet plate process, which means that photographers are creating photographs on glass plates, which are the first negatives, right? For those of us who remember a time of photography before our smartphones, remember what negatives are, you can print as many positive prints from these negatives as you want. It's very much the same idea. So one thing that allows for is the wide proliferation of these cards called carte de visite. And they are really small. They are the size of a baseball card, and essentially, I always tell this to my students, we're located in Fenway, right near Fenway Park. So I have a lot of baseball fans in my classes. They are kind of like the baseball cards of the 1860s. You want to collect them all. You want to trade them with your friends. You want both, a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, but you also are kind of curious to know what Jefferson Davis looks like, because he's someone you hear about and you don't know what he looks like either, right? You can't just Google these people, these famous figures. You want to kind of create this world for yourself, and so you purchase these things. You can purchase them by mail, you can purchase them at events, you can go to a city and visit a gallery and purchase them. And so Sojourner Truth decides to start sitting for them in 1860s. And she is unusual because she copyrights her image herself. And in contrast, someone like Abraham Lincoln would have gone to a photographer, left it to the photographer to sell it on their own and promote it themselves. But Sojourner Truth wanted to fully control her image. She copyrighted it herself, and she took many different photographs over the years, but a lot of them came back to this same style that we're seeing here. So she's seated, she has knitting in her hand, she has flowers next to her on the table, very much suggesting a domestic parlor scene here. There's a book open. She's wearing a very plain outfit, kind of a Quaker, simple style outfit, as well as this head wrap. So by the 1860s, she is in her 70s, actually. So she was born in the late 1790s. And she is someone who is she was born into slavery in New York at that time, but over the course of her lifetime, she became very much involved in women's rights and anti-slavery activism, and a leading lecturer. So she is, in the 1860s, selling her autobiography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, but then also selling these photographic portraits. And you can imagine why it appealed to her to sell portraits instead of books on her lecture tours. It's far easier to carry them around. And actually, she could take one of these photographs to a new photographer anywhere. The photographer could take a picture of the original photograph and reproduce more for her. So it's very easy to make more and sell more. So she would sell these to her interested audience members. As you can see at the bottom, it says, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." The shadow is a 19th century term for a photograph, right? So they're literally made by exposing glass plates to sunlight. So the cloudier the day, the longer it takes to sit for a photograph, etc. To support the substance, that's herself. This is how she's supporting herself. She is a working woman. But it's also these very substantial reforms that she's advocating for. So this is a very meaningful portrait that's really being circulated in the 1860s. And because so many archives have these today, we know that it's circulated fairly widely. Not just this portrait, but the other ones that are very similar to this one. On the other side, we have Stanton and Anthony. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the one with the white floofy hair, and Susan B. Anthony has her brown hair pulled back. And they're seated at a table in Napoleon Serigny's studio in New York. And they went there in August of 1870 to take this portrait. And unlike Sojourner Truth, they did not copyright it. They left it there for him to sell. We know he sold it over the course of several years, because you can see at the bottom of this carte de visite an address. We have different cards from this series from different addresses that he was at over the years. And this is, so I would argue that they are inspired by Sojourner Truth's choice to take photographs of herself and circulate them in order to do the same for themselves in their movement, right? So Sojourner Truth in her portrait is emphasizing that she is a very respectable woman. She's emphasizing that she is a very competent woman. She has her glasses on. She is not, she's trying to really counter these stereotypes of not only women, but also African Americans that are dominating popular culture in the 19th century. Stanton and Anthony, very much inspired by this, are choosing to create their own version of female political leadership here in 1870, and they continue to do so. The political cartoons change a little bit in response to images like this. So unlike the previous images that I showed you, you can tell this is Susan B. Anthony, and you can tell that this is copied directly from that portrait that we saw before. And you can also see a lot of the similar themes that we already pointed out, right? We have women doing roles that are not typically as things that they're supposed to be doing, right? A female police officer, Susan B. Anthony is in this aggressive pose. She was often portrayed with this umbrella that's kind of like a sword. Her boots have spurs on them. And then one of my favorite details on this and many other anti-suffrage cartoons are like the man holding a baby, kind of like the sign of the apocalypse for 19th century readers who really feared that this was something that was going to happen if women won political rights. And if anti-suffragists got anything right, yes, men now do hold babies and women vote. So the other thing to note is that this artist must have maybe even known Anthony. Anthony had an eye issue. And you can see in this kind of close-up version of the illustration that the artist actually put that into the illustration. It's often why she took photographs of herself in profile. That's something that she really valued. And so just to kind of give us a little bit of a sense, this is a presidential poster from this time period. These are the kinds of people that suffragists want to look like, right? Leading political figures, kind of with these very public portraits. And you guys, I'm sure, know that in 1880s, we're thinking about this moment. It's the centennial of the United States in 1876. Americans are looking back at the past, and suffragists like Stan and Anthony are really thinking seriously about how to grow this movement. By the late 1860s, 1869 and 1870, we've got the first two national suffrage associations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. Unfortunately, Lucy Stone is largely forgotten by the general public. She supported the 15th Amendment. She had a much larger organization, a much more popular newspaper. But Stan and Anthony are the ones we remember, and that's partially because they literally wrote the history of women's suffrage. It was originally supposed to be a 1-volume history. It turned out to be a 6-volume, 1,000-page per volume series. And I'm sure for those of you who've worked with them, you know how heavy those tomes are. And so in addition to telling this story and shaping the story of the movement, they also chose who we remember. So one reason we have many of the portraits we have today is because they were featured in the history of women's suffrage. And you can see the similarities in these kind of portraits, who they wanted to look like, looking off into the future, looking like they are respectable figures for the general public. Susan B. Anthony was the person who was the most involved in selecting the portraits and working with other suffragists to make them happen. So she was literally writing letters to women's rights activists across the country saying, send me your photograph. I want you to send me, any number of photographs. Tell me which one you have your best eyes and best smile and best hair, and we'll combine them all together into this engraving to put them in this book. She did require suffragists to actually pay for the engraving to be made. And so it was, they chose fairly nice and great, fairly good artists to engrave. So this was a significant sum. And Anthony knew that this was a problem. She wrote about how she lamented how this really shaped the course of this movement, but she also didn't do anything about it. So Anthony selected all white women. She selected no men. There were plenty of men, as you all know, who were women's rights activists, leaders during this time period. And she really, in doing so, shaped the women we remember today, that we have the most accessible portraits of today in documentaries and museums and teaching, everything. And it certainly shaped the history that we remember. So I'm going to jump forward in time a little bit. So there's that early effort to kind of create a portraiture of the women's suffrage movement, create women as leaders, but that really shifts in the early 20th century. So rather than focusing on women as political leaders, perhaps as equals, by the early 20th century, suffragists are doubling down into this idea that women's voting rights will actually reinforce gender norms. They're no longer trying to convince the public that women could be good presidents. They're trying to convince them that getting the vote will make them better mothers and better supporters of the community. So here we have Blanche Ames, who is one of the many professional female artists who gets a great boost from her work in the suffrage movement. She published this engraving in 1915. It's published in the Women's Journal, as well as the Boston Transcript. So this is just to give you a sense of the fact that these suffrage artists are creating imagery as well as articles for their own internal papers and propaganda, but that's also being picked up by the press elsewhere, especially by the 1910s. So this is called Double the Power of the Home. 2 good votes are better than 1. You have a woman seated, surrounded by 3 children, a baby on her shoulder. This is kind of a familiar, Mary and child kind of Christian imagery. This really recalls that for me. And she's teaching her one child how to read. Her other child has a doll. There's a cat on the side here. There's a God bless our home sign above her head and a teapot steaming on the stove behind her. And this is intended to give you this idea that this suffragist is a good mother, takes good care of her family, and therefore deserves this right. But it also tells you who suffragists like Blanche Ames think should have this right? Not all women were able to, stay home and care for their children all day. This is a very particular type of woman that we see here. This is a really popular theme by this time. Rose O'Neill is the one who created this poster. She was another female artist that got a big boost from the suffrage movement. She was the designer of the Cupid doll, if you've ever heard of them. This is Give Mother the Vote, published in the 1910s. It was actually printed by the National Women's Suffrage Association Publishing Company. So by the 1910s, they had national press committees, state press committees that the National Press Committee was working with, publicity committees, art publicity committees, and this was a well-run machine by the 1910s. In the 1890s is where that machinery really starts being developed. They actually adopt a lot of it from the Women's Christian Temperance Union structure, which is the largest women's organization in the 1890s. So this is something that, whereas Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth were working on their own to distribute portraits in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s, this is totally different by the 1910s. And the public sees this. The public knows this is happening. This is Boardman Robinson's The Type Has Changed from the New York Tribune. So the original stereotype of suffragists is of these, grim-faced women in unfashionable clothing, whereas the new type are these fashionable women in high-style clothing, younger women, more beautiful women, right? This is not literally true, right? These are still, suffragists. Some of them are the same suffragists in 1911 that are in, 20 years earlier. But this is the public image that they're promoting. And you can guess why, right? This is a type that by this time is very popular. You can see the similarities between like the Gibson girl here and the idealized suffrage style. And so, of course, one of the, there are many people that ideal leaves out. And Mary Church Terrell is someone who really goes back to the original strategies pioneered by Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and then adopted by Susan B. Anthony to kind of create, as much as she can, her own public image for women of color. So Mary Church Terrell was one of the first women of color to graduate with an undergraduate degree. She went on to become a teacher and lived in Washington, D.C., and she became really involved in reformer circles. She worked with Josephine Ruffin and wrote for the Women's Era, which is a publication, the first reform publication out of Boston. It was really aimed at women of color reformers. And she eventually became elected the first president of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. And a lot of historians have ignored this organization because technically from the start, they did not start out as an official suffrage organization, but Terrell was a lifelong supporter of women's voting rights. And they were fighting for a range of goals, women's voting rights, but also against lynching, in favor of better education for their children, just a true range of ideas that the suffrage associations that were run by these leading white women were not interested in focusing on at all. So Mary Church Terrell is someone who is creating her own image of what leading women of color should look like. As you can see, she's fairly wealthy. She is an elite Black woman. She's a light-skinned Black woman. And so both of these things give her significant privilege. Her mother was a very famous hairstylist who had a very successful business. Her father ran a very successful saloon. So she came from money. And she was certainly not afraid to let people know about that. She did a lot of self-promotion. So I said that she kind of borrowed strategies from people like Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony in creating this image of herself. And that's because the National Association of Colored Women just did not have the finances, the resources, the staffing that enabled the National American Women's Suffrage Association to create the kind of propaganda that they wanted to, right? So Terrell asks, the NACW early on, can we create a press committee? And they just say, no, we just don't have the budget, we don't have the resources for it. So she effectively does this herself. And you can see here, this is a Voice of the Negro sketch by artist John H. Adams. And he did studies of both images of the new Negro man and of the new Negro woman in Voice of the Negro, which was a kind of more academic, highly a publication aimed at very highly educated African Americans at the time. And you can see that either the artist kind of is thinking about someone like Terrell when he's creating this sketch, or Terrell is thinking about the ways that she'd like to kind of be part of this ideal in this sketch too. And this isn't really represented, of course, in a lot of the suffrage propaganda. This is a wonderful, colorful printing from the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., which went down Pennsylvania Avenue. And it was not the first suffrage parade in the United States, but it was the first one in Washington, D.C., with kind of like this national weight to it. It was organized by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who had both spent time in Britain and worked with British suffragists. They had participated in a lot of spectacular public protests and really brought those ideas back to the United States. They wanted people to kind of keep suffrage in the news and force voters, force politicians to actually address the question. And so this is what they're doing in the 1913s. And so one thing to note is, of course, that women of color are being excluded by these parades. I'm sure you guys have seen pickets, pictures of pickets and pickets of paraders, and you really don't see that many women of color there. I mean, that's one reason for that, and I'm sorry to kind of put this terrible image on your screen for too long, but is that women of color were often excluded as much as possible from these events. We have votes for colored ladies here. We have the white women kind of aghast that these Black women want to join in the march. You can see this is a very racist stereotype representation of these women. And I'm just going to move forward. I don't want that on the screen for too long. One reason why that image was circulated at that time, which was in Puck, which just to give you a sense, that's a popular satirical newspaper at the time. Puck was commenting on the fact that these women were marching in to Washington, D.C. and actually telling Alice Paul that we will not march. These white women were telling Alice Paul that we will not march if Black women are marching too. Ultimately, Inez Milholland really helps convince Alice Paul to allow Black women to march. Initially, it's supposed to be in the back of the parade, but that actually is not how it fully worked out. Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, the Delta Sigma Thetas of Howard University, all of these women marched as part of the parade. And in my many years of visual culture research, this is actually the only picture, the one that you see on the screen now, is the only picture that I have ever found advocating for women's voting rights by arguing that women of color are good mothers and good protectors. And this was published in The Crisis, which it was originally published in The Crisis. This is also published separately as a poster, which is the type of image we see here. And this shows a Black woman holding a bat called the Federal Constitution, beating down segregation, Jim Crow laws, grandfather clauses, etc. This is a really complex, this has a lot going on. In the background, there's a long thought bubble, but basically it's to suggest that this Black man is running away from these problems and the Black woman has to step up and take care of them. And also at the very bottom of the text, it says what votes for women means to the South. So as a lot of you know, women were gaining the right to vote in states across the country long before the 19th Amendment was passed, starting in Wyoming in 1869, but extending beyond that. Southern states did not grant women the right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment, and were very reluctant to ratify the 19th Amendment itself. And so we have this type of image to us why these white suffrage organizations are not really highlighting women of color as part of the group that they're trying to enfranchise here. By the late 1910s, suffragists are doing two different things, and one is emphasizing that they are patriotic, good citizens, and that is why they deserve the right to vote, right? It's very much a continuation of the earlier good mother imagery that we were looking at. This is a pretty famous World War I poster called The Greatest Mother in the World. And one thing that I've been really rethinking in the last month is the ways that not only World War I shifted people to really emphasize that women were great as nurses and caregivers, but also this 1918 flu epidemic that swept the nation just following World War I, when women were enlisted in a massive way to be nurses. So I think that that's something that we really undervalued when we're thinking about World War I as being this catalyst. I think it was also, I think we should think about the ways that it might have also been a combination of World War I and this flu crisis that follows. And I'm excited to think more about that, and I'm eager to see if you guys have thoughts about that too. So when we're thinking about kind of ending this, I wanted to kind of end this on how does the suffrage imagery move forward with us? Women's political imagery has changed dramatically. So while suffragists loved these very professional posters, everyone would have the same one and kind of create the same very highly orchestrated particular idea, most recently, that's not really the kind of feminist imagery that people really embrace, right? In 2017, the Women's March, the most famous, popular, interesting thing to read about the Women's March was about the people's interesting posters, the real array of posters that were part of this march, the array of ideas, of imagery, etc. And although the organization actually created official imagery, they hired professional artists to create this imagery. They put it freely available on their website, encouraged people to download it and print these posters. This is not what people came away with from the movement. People really came away with this idea that we each had our own perspective. That said, these women's rights leaders of the past, you can see on the screen here, Susan B. Anthony, Eleanor Roosevelt, and if someone can tell me who the woman in the black hat is, I will be forever grateful. I have tried to think about who this is for a long time. I have no idea. But we're still thinking about the ways that even in the 21st century, we're building on these previous women's rights organizers. And most recently, people are thinking about the suffrage movement by wearing white. This is something we've seen for the past several years. And this is a color that the suffragists wore often in parades. And a lot of us know that this was a color associated with virtue, with this kind of, tinge of kind of morality that's kind of suggested by this whiteness purity. But the other reason that suffragists wore white is because their publicity manager, Charles Heaslip, told them that if they wore white, they would appear better in photographs, right? So against these dark streets, women in white would look better in the newspapers. So this is where I'm going to end for today. I'm eagerly awaiting your questions, but with this idea that these things that we're very familiar with the suffrage movement were very strategically thought of, especially in images, in the ways that they are part of this debate between suffragists and their opponents throughout this long 19th century period.
So, Courtney, can we start with the Q&A now, or are you going to be moderating? I can start? Okay, great. Hi, Allison. My name is Praminda Jacob, and I am a professor of art history and museum studies in the visual arts department. And I'm also now serving as Associate Dean for Research. I loved your talk, as you can imagine, because it's very close to my area on visual culture and the relation between politics and imagery. There were many things that came up, of course, but one question that I have for you is, there's a real continuity of images, and you point out how one set of images build upon another throughout history. And when you showed the Blanche Ames picture where two votes are better than one, with the woman and her baby and her two children, it immediately brought to mind Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother of 1936. I just looked up the dates and things. But so you remember that's an iconic image of the Works Project Administration, the farm security, I think it was called the Farm Security Initiative, where they would send photographers out to capture all of the images of the Depression and what people were how people were suffering. And so it was really interesting because the next image you showed also was by John Adams of the South's Battalion of Death, where this woman is the 1915 image of her attacking, but she too has these children kind of clinging to her. The first image by Blanche Ames is a very positive image. The other one is a fearful image, but the woman is very strong in both images. And likewise, the Dorothea Lange has the baby and two children clinging to her. And so I was just wondering whether you wanted to, in your research, have you seen this sort of continuity of a message? And I never knew of these other two images. And when I would talk about the Dorothea Lange image in my art history classes, I was, why did it become so iconic? Why did it become so powerful? And I think it's because of continuity. I don't know whether you had any thoughts about that.
I mean, I think you're right. I think this is a continuously popular theme in our imagery when we think about femininity and motherhood, and what being an acceptable public figure looks like. Motherhood is still wrapped up in it, and we see that in, whether it's, a leading political candidate, having to kind of talk about her family in a more meaningful way than perhaps male counterparts. But the examples that you give are spectacular as well, right? I mean, these are the examples that you give are very much in this tradition. And, I think that the suffragists was the group that, we have this idea of like women having it all, right? And I think it's the suffragists who kind of put forth that idea, right? Their idea of creating that concept was to suggest that women could have children and care for their households, but then also have these other broader scopes. And, I think that today we still have this complicated connection between, motherhood and femininity in these very public images. It's a great connection. Yes. And if I could do like, a book that was 1 million pages long and went far more forward, we could have done a lot more.
I just wanted to say thank you and best wishes to you.
Oh, thank you for the question. Yeah, that was great. And I see in the chat that there's some like speculation about who the woman is. I've thought it was Zora Neale Hurston. I have not found a portrait that that the poster might have copied. And I'll look into Juliet Lowe too. That's very possible.
I also thought of Zora Neale Hurston, and I was going to suggest that. I know, but she's just such a important figure. I think she did wear a hat a lot and things. Yeah, you should check it out anyway.
I think so too, but I couldn't find a portrait that was like a perfect copy of it, so I don't feel comfortable confirming it. But yeah, and I'm looking at Harriet Tubman as a possibility. Sure. Let's see. I do think it is a darker skinned woman based on the poster, but at the same time, it's a drawing on cardboard, so who knows? And I see one question on here, which is which suffrage organizations hired publicity managers? And that's a great question because, interestingly, sometimes they went back and forth between the different suffrage associations. So NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the far larger organization by the 1910s, hired Charles Heaslip. But then Alice Paul decided he was doing too good of work for them and brought him over to the National Women's Party. So this is a tactic that both organizations are taking advantage of. They see the value, and they see that photojournalism is on the rise. They see that having these directed advertising and political campaigns are on the rise, and they're really forging into this new space, really kind of creating new types of political campaigns as they're doing it. And so they are all in on hiring publicity managers.
Hi, can I make a comment or add to this?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name is Debbie Farthing. I'm a graduate student. And last semester, I worked on a project on women's suffrage for a class with Dr. Marengolo. But when you were talking about the image of the mother and 2 good votes from every home, and this idea of the woman who's deserving to have the vote, I think this also plays into the idea of let's make sure that all women have the vote, because we want to still make sure that white women help to keep the white population in power. I came across a letter that was written by the person I was researching, talking about let's make sure that we do this so that we can keep how did she put it? I have to look this up because it's just that we need to keep essentially the better race in power and so on and so forth. But the other thing that I wanted to tell you about is I came across a movie made in 1914 called Coontown Suffragettes.
Oh, I have not seen that. I don't want to,
It's
but
actually listed on IMDb because I had to look up the date, but it was 1914. And in it, the women, the colored women, go to a white suffragette meeting and they're told that, why are you doing all this work? Because all of the colored men are lazy. And so this reinforces that stereotype of, you know, the women have to stand up and address these issues because the men are running away from it. So I thought it was just an interesting intersection of that with this movie and that image when one was 1914 and the other one was 1915. So yeah.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you made a really valuable point here. It's really important to remember that imagery, like the image that we looked at by Blanche Ames, is implicitly about white supremacy. You don't find many, public quotes from suffragists saying we want only white women to vote. But we all know the 15th Amendment does not say in the amendment black men are granted the right to vote, right? It says that race cannot be used to prevent people from voting. 1890s, we've got these passage of laws, variety of laws that prevent men of color from voting. So by the early 20th century, these white suffragists are perfectly aware that if they pass the amendment as is, the legislation that is preventing men of color from voting and poorer people of color from voting is also going to prevent women of color perfectly subtly part of this conversation throughout. So that's a really important point to remember. And that sounds like a fascinating video. I'll look into it. One video, if you guys are interested in kind of like a fun teaching tool too, is A Lively Affair from 1914. And that is an anti-suffrage film. It's on YouTube, very easily accessible. That is very much a kind of film version of those anti-suffrage cartoons that we were looking at earlier, and it's very fun to show in class. It's like a good conversation starter.
I wanted to make one other point, and you showed a print earlier of women in kind of their bloomer costumes, dressed kind of like men, with their mannish affectations and smoking cigars and so on and so forth. I'm actually more of a fashion historian which clearly is part of women's history. But the women, the suits that they're wearing are made of like these really, what would be really loud plaids and the sort of thing that people who didn't have good taste might be wearing. So I think that's another dig at women. If they're gonna like take on all of the negative attributes of low level men who are, poor taste, classless, aggressive, all of these things.
Yeah, that's an important point. It's a class-based argument as well as a gendered one.
Yes, absolutely. It makes me think of that scene in Gone with the Wind when the guy who used to be the overseer comes up and he's going to buy Tara, and the clothes that they are wearing are just like, poor people who suddenly have money idea of taste, and it's terrible. So it's kind of that sort of connection, that visual connection to, if they do this, they're just, again, they're going to take on all of the bad affectations of men, and the wrong kind of men.
I wanted to pick up on Allison on your question about the 1918 flu epidemic and its role in some of this. Just wanted to point out to you that the Girl Scouts of America, which I follow on Facebook because I was a Girl Scout, have been picturing recently the images they have of Girl Scouts supporting public health and supporting and providing services during that 1918 epidemic. So there's some imagery there in terms of women in public and that epidemic.
Yeah, that's great. I know the historian for the Girl Scouts, and she's a good suffrage supporter, suffrage historian.
We have a question in the chat.
Did the women marching and picketing deliberately wear uniform like hats and coats, or was that just the fashion? And the answer is both. So there were actually patterns so that people could create their own suffrage attire, suffrage sashes, suffrage dresses, you name it. There was you could purchase it by mail. You could get the pattern yourself and make it yourself. Anything, either of those things. But that doesn't mean necessarily that everyone actually had that particular uniform. Certainly they were basing these off of the popular fashions of the day too. So a combination of those. It's amazing how much of this was coordinated by the 1910s. Which is why I showed you that contrast with the Women's March, right? Because it's such a drastically different visual, spectacle. And I think it's really interesting that one component of the Women's March were those pink knitted hats, which is the pussy hats, right? So it's kind of this interesting moment of actually sharing maybe a pattern, or maybe not maybe necessarily a pattern for something as simple like that, but women crafting something in order to kind of participate in a political protest, which I think is a really interesting through line between the suffragists and modern activists.
Allison, thank you for this wonderful talk, and it was so fun. Actually, I really enjoyed looking at the images up close. Virtual.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us who are elderly and have bad eyes. This is a little bit of an unfair question, but I know you'd be the expert who would know. Is there any difference in how U.S. suffragists depicted their movement, themselves, their ideals, compared to European women, or even better, non-European women? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So, I mean, the closest relationship that we have is, of course, with British suffragists, right? So we have American suffragists really are defining themselves against British suffragists, particularly those that are more militant, right? The ones who are setting fire to buildings, breaking windows, endangering people, right? If this is American suffragists, like the National American Women's Suffrage Association, are openly condemning the British suffragists. They are also openly condemning Alice Paul and her National Women's Party for those same tactics. And so this is, so that's one kind of comparison. So there are a lot of international suffrage associations, as I'm sure you know. So there is collaboration between American suffragists and suffragists across the globe. But when we're thinking about what's most popular in American media, it's the idea of defining American suffragists against British suffragists. And of course, Alice Paul saying, I don't care if you guys connect us to them at all. We're doing these public protests regardless. Of course, American suffragists never became as destructive of property or kind of violent as British suffragists chose to do. So that was a pretty significant difference. And suffrage happened so differently in so many other countries and at so many different times, right? Like French women didn't gain the right to vote until the 1940s. New Zealand is the first one. So this is really wrapped up in this turn of the century women's club movement is kind of the place where they're all kind of meeting and spreading these tactics around.
There's another question in the chat.
Yes, the National Women's History Alliance had a float in the Rose Parade this year, and they had marchers with the float who all wore white. Yes.
There's two.
Oh, I see it. I love it. You mentioned Sojourner Truth copyrighted her image. Was that a common practice in the 19th century? I know it is today. And the answer is it was not the common practice in the 19th century, which is why it's so remarkable to me that she went out of her way to do it. She copyrighted it herself. In my experience, I have from the 1860s, I haven't found and come across anyone else's portraits who like goes through the hassle of copyrighting them themselves if they're not like a studio, like a professional photography owner, right? Like they would copyright their work. But an individual copyrighting their own portrait is extremely rare. She wanted full control of her portrait. There's a quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a fellow women's rights leader, who kind of says that Sojourner Truth keeps close care over her portraits because she doesn't want anyone else to be taking advantage and to be making money off of them. She wants to sell them herself. And there's this link between self-ownership and her formerly enslaved life, right? So I think that this choice to copyright is a choice to not allow other people to own even her likeness in a way that to own and kind of control her likeness. It's a great question. It's a really unusual detail. And yes, you guys mentioned the Rose Parade. This is something. I think this is really interesting that women in the 21st century are adopting this suffrage white. You know, for me, when they started wearing it, I did not feel great about it, right? The suffragists did a lot of wonderful things, but they were also not, we're in the 21st century, and I think that we've got a whole range of other new ideas to think about. And so at first, I think that I'd be curious to see what you guys think. I was really not supportive of, suffragists wearing white, but I think it's really interesting when we're looking at the ways that has been that type of dress has been changed. The meaning has been changed because so many different kinds of women are wearing it in the 21st century. And I think that has helped alter the meaning from the original like suffrage ideas.
I have a question that might take us in a slightly different direction. You started by talking about, one of your main points about the changing role of technology or the forces of changing technology in the developments of these images. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about that part of it. And I know, you talked a little bit about the proliferation of images that was made possible by the development of the glass plate. And how cheap it was to be able to get a Kerr and Ives image. But do you want to just elaborate a little bit beyond those two that have to do with sort of access?
Sure, yeah. So when we're thinking, I'll kind of do like a really quick overview. So in this late 18th century period, people have very little access to pictures in comparison to what comes later, right? It's largely, portraits of George Washington. You might be surprised by how many portraits of Martha Washington are circulating at this time. Well into the 19th century, Martha Washington is probably the most visible American woman, the most recognizable American woman. And they're often portraits of her as a young woman, actually reproducing portraits from her first marriage before she was married to George Washington. So in that time period, in this earliest time period, there's painted portraits, which have a very limited reach. But then these engraved portraits, which range from very expensive mezzotints, which is the type of print we looked at, the ladies of Edenton, Patriotic Society ladies of Edenton print, to like very rough engraved portraits that only barely resemble, someone like George Washington. And in the 1830s, it's when lithographs become extremely accessible. So prints become cheaper. You can purchase a pretty decent portrait of George Washington and Martha Washington to hang on your walls. And trust me, when you see these like 19th century photographs of people's homes, like that was something that a lot of people had on their walls. Martha Washington really represented the kind of ideal American woman, this patriotic hostess and supporter of her husband's aims. And she was actually the first and only woman who's been on American paper currency, and that was in the 1880s. And I feel like that's a really shocking thing to know. So it's in the 1830s also, at the same time that lithographs are becoming popular, that photographs, daguerreotypes, the first types of photographs are being created. They're, as I said, they're unique. You cannot reproduce them. And so it's not until the mid 1850s, 1855, when you have this wet plate process making photographs far more accessible to the broader public. The only ones that people are really getting in the 1850s and 60s are these small carte visite, very tiny baseball card size carte visite, but also cabinet cards, which are slightly larger and more like a 5x7 print. Not very big yet, right? In 1870, there's a brand new printing process called the halftone printing process, which is developed for the very first time, but it basically fizzles out. No one is interested in it. The halftone printing process actually allows for the reproduction of photographs in text. So it could have led to the printing of photographs in newspapers and books and magazines, but it really didn't really catch on. And so in the 1860s, when you're thinking about, like photographs of the Civil War, the only way you're purchasing a book of photographs of the Civil War in the 1860s, which people did, they were hand-glued photographs into these books, so extremely expensive. The only other way you're seeing photographs of the Civil War is if you buy individual prints, or you get, like a Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, or a Harper's Weekly illustrated newspaper. It's in the 1850s, kind of going back, it's in the 1850s when those types of newspapers become extremely popular. Illustrated newspapers were very much separate from the daily newspapers that did not have nearly as many, very few images well into the 1870s. And that's because of things like the steam printing presses. You have these steel plates that are being created so you can print more and more newspapers from these individual plates. It originally took, an artist, 8 hours to create one engraving. But by the 1850s and 1860s, they're dividing up that engraving so that, 8 different artists are each working on a corner. So it's much faster to get all of these images printed, right? So it's not until 1890 when there's a transition from these illustrated newspapers, these engravings, to publishing more photographs, right? So I'm sure some of us have seen Jacob Riis's or heard of Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives from the 1890. That's really famous for the number of photographs of the New York poor people in New York, the poor conditions that they lived in. And one reason why that book was so famous is because it included these photographs. Those were halftones. And so that was kind of 1890s is the shift towards reproducing photographs. And by the early 20th century, photojournalism is an actual profession. People are sending photographs via telegraph across the country. So like after the 1913 parade, you could send a telegraph of a photograph from the parade to a newspaper in California overnight, anytime. So that was a major shift in visual culture. That means that photographs by the 1910s are starting to become the currency of news in a way that previously it was really artistic illustrations. So that's why suffragists are taking advantage of it. That's why they're wearing white, trying to create these, these events that people think are worth photographing, worth sending photojournalists to. So one thing that I'd really like to convey by thinking about the ways that images and politics are connected is the ways that suffragists are looking at every new type of visual technology and taking advantage of it, finding a new way to use it as part of their campaign. And one of the wonderful things about working on this particular movement is that it did last such a long time. You can see how, one group looked to carte visite and said, we're going to do everything we can with this. And the next group is like, well, we're going to do everything we can with these new photojournalists in this halftone printing process. And it's really fascinating to see how that changes. It's really amazing to watch the way they innovate.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Anyone else? I have the view where I can't see everybody, so.
Seems like we have a lot of debate in the chat about Zora Neale Hurston. So
Yeah, it looks that way. Yeah, it sounds like there's not going to be a quick conclusion to that question.
if you find it, let me know.
Well, we did find an image of Harriet Tubman in that kind of hat.
Oh, really? Okay, I will have to look at it more closely.
I was going to say, and I Googled Harriet Tubman in a hat, and there's an image, but there's also a statue, bronze in Arkansas.
Great.
With that sort of hat.
That's like a good lead. Okay, thank you.
I would love it to be Harriet Tubman.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
Could be.
I don't know. I think the other like drawings that were done like seem to be close, like replications of people's faces, and that person does not look like Harriet Tubman. So
She doesn't either, but
nor does it look like Zora Neale Hurston. And I agree with the comment that the hat and the style that the person's wearing seems a little bit pre Zora Neale Hurston. So it'll be mystery.
Well, I was struck by the what made me think of Zora Neale Hurston was a very common image in the film. And when you Google, you get both this image of Harriet Tubman and you get images from the film. And I assume the film worked with some of the historical images.
Yeah, just same with me. When I Googled Harriet Tubman in a hat, I just got a lot of Cynthia Erivo photos.
In a hat.
When I Googled it as well, I could only find a rather small image of Harriet Tubman in the hat. So I'm thinking it could be her, because if you blow it up, it's going to be kind of grainy if you're tracing it or trying to draw from it.
Mm.
So I'm thinking that could actually be Harriet Tubman.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think if you look at the clothing, it's a quintessential scouting uniform.
I agree with that. I do agree with that.
Yeah, so the Juliette Lowe thing, yeah. And I wish it was Harriet Tubman.
We have another question.
Very convincing arguments for many different wonderful women.
There's a question in the chat.
I was wondering the degree to which women in the movement harnessed images of labor and work during the World War I effort to make a case for enfranchisement. And the answer is yes, absolutely. They were emphasizing that women working toward World War I was one reason why women should get the vote. So one example would be, there's a great photograph of farmerettes, suffrage farmerettes, who are working in the fields and supporting the production of produce and other agricultural goods during that time period, but also women as nurses. There's a lot of great photographs of female nurses. A lot of suffrage organizations supported female nurses overseas, and this kind of was part of this conversation that I kind of brought up in the talk, but that I'm still thinking about, which is this relationship between the World War I contributions and women's contributions during the pandemic, the flu crisis of 1918. Really interestingly, Woodrow Wilson delivers this speech to the Senate endorsing suffrage on September 30th, 1918. The week after Washington, D.C. is inundated by the flu, the Speaker of the House is ill, they have to close the public galleries to guests. And, now, under feeling the ways that, how this can really shut down society in a meaningful way, it seems like, oh, well, of course they didn't, pass suffrage after Woodrow Wilson gave his speech on September 30th. It just seems like, it seems like a far more meaningful moment, event than we had previously considered.
Thank you. It was me who I revealed myself. Thanks for that answer. The image that came to mind was this one about women working on munitions, and I was thinking about the kind of really somewhat tense relationship between women like I think there's an essay by Jane Addams that's called "If Men Were Seeking the Franchise," and it's all about how women would have to temper how warmongering they are, and it's always that essay striking to me because one of the things that Adams' essay seems to be wrestling with is like, we don't want to just be enfranchised so that we can vote for your wars to continue, you know. And so this image of helping build, you know, women working in the munition factory is striking, maybe for the way that it kind of dredges that up, which is like, you know, how is the women's vote actually going to be maybe leveraged to conduct not, you know, wars, invasions, a kind of, you know, imperial effort or whatever, going forward. Not just thinking about World War I, but other ongoing conflicts in the period and in the region. And so, so I was curious to know if you had run into sort of more, especially where it's like women working in alongside men in munitions, but also just sort of anywhere in the war effort, and if that was in tension with some of the writing, the suffrage writing.
I think that's a really important point, right? Carrie Chapman Catt, who's the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, is a pacifist. Jeanette Rankin, the woman from Montana who's the first woman elected to Congress, also a pacifist, casts her ballot against the United States entry into World War I. And Carrie Chapman Catt, even though Catt was a pacifist, she believed that vote would set the suffrage movement back. That women showing that they weren't, you know, supporters of this effort, that they weren't going to work alongside men in a meaningful way and kind of support this kind of this venture, could be very detrimental. And so that's, I think, as you know, as you're suggesting here, that's why one of the reasons why suffragists are showing themselves as meaningful supporters of the war, because they think it's a political move to help win support.
Anyone else want to chime in with the question?
Someone pulled up a great Nina Allender cartoon here, which she's another wonderful of those like early generation of professional artists who did a lot of wonderful, fascinating cartoons.
Well, I think on that note, we're going to thank you for a really terrific talk and a great opportunity to discuss those images. And I think we're all going to look forward to this book. So thanks for being with us, and to everyone who's joined in. I think a successful Humanities Forum. And we'll see you all soon. Take care.
Thanks for having me. It was wonderful to hear all of your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
You.